The television in the green room hummed like a nervous insect, an endless loop of anchors and churn graphics that turned grief into texture. Kelly sat on the edge of a worn couch, one hand curled around a paper cup gone limp with cold coffee, the other pressed against her mouth, as if to hold something, an avalanche of words or a memory at bay. The headline crawled beneath the studio logo, "Tragic Update, Mark Consuelos' Cancer Battle." Her eyes, usually bright and bossy with humor, were glassy, and a single tear tracked its slow, deliberate path across her cheek. When the call came that morning, it had been clipped and professional. "Are you available?" a producer asked. Kelly had laughed, a reflex, because of course she was available. But the laugh died before it reached the end of the sentence. She'd known the news could come one of these mornings. She'd lived under the quiet, watchful canopy of maybe for weeks, an ache she'd learned to live with like a chronic bruise. Still, the news arriving in headlines felt like someone had taken a blunt instrument to the world and left it ragged. People would want the story. She would have to tell it. Yet she could not fathom how to translate private sorrow into public sentences. Mark was in the hospital. The words looked small on the page of the press release. They sounded enormous in her head. Kelly thought of the first time she saw him. Laughter and a coffee shop corner, a flirty line turned into an inside joke. They had built a life out of ordinary moments, kids with sticky hands, late-night jokes, the dark hum of a New York apartment in winter. Fame had been a seasoning rather than a foundation. Mark and Kelly had been each other's weather. Now the weather had changed. She remembered vividly the last night Mark had come home from chemo. He'd shuffled and wearing a beanie, a small grin playing at the edges of his mouth, like moonlight. He was thinner than she remembered, too thin, and his hands trembled when he reached for her. They had eaten cereal for dinner, poured milk over sadness, and pretended it tasted like normalcy. He'd told her a story about how he'd once lost a sock in a laundromat in New Jersey, a small absurdity that made them both laugh until tears blurred their vision. It was those kinds of laughter that Kelly clung to now, the small, absurd, entirely human moments that cancer cannot sterilize. In the stark corridors of the hospital, beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look celestial and fragile, she replayed them like talismans. Mark's voice on the phone had been a shade of huskier than usual, the kind of voice that had broken in airport goodbyes and late-night confessions. "Don't make my headlines sad, Kels," he joked weakly through a mask of pain. He'd always been the one to deflect, to turn dread into something manageable. But there were fissures now, lines that could not be made whole by punchlines. The doctors had used clinical words, metastasis, progression, palliative, but the language they spoke did not capture the riot of details that composed a life, the exact way he folded his hands, the particular laugh he used when he tried to sing, the silver fleck in his eyebrow that never seemed to grow older. At the hospital, beneath an anonymous door number, Kelly sat with her head bowed against his mattress and let herself speak. She told him all the things that had never needed saying, the thank yous, the apologies, the small confessions like how she sometimes hid the cookie jar from herself. Mark held her hand with the same solid grip he had always used to anchor her in the swirl of studio lights and schedule demands. His fingers were cool, his eyes were lucid. He listened as if she were his favorite program, and she had sung to him the lyrics of their life. Friends came in a steady, reverent stream. Colleagues whose faces had been background noise in the studio now became a chorus of human kindness. They shared memories. The time Mark crashed a live segment with a rubber chicken. The afternoon Kelly tried to teach Mark how to dance and only succeeded in making him invent a new step that the kids later named. People talked about the way Mark loved, without reservations, like a person who believed love was the only renewable resource worth harvesting. Their stories were like beads along a rosary, each one a prayer. Outside, the world moved at its usual ferocious pace. Social media swelled with speculation, rumor, sentiment. Pundits parsed timelines and tweeted condolences. Strangers who had never met Kelly or Mark offered prayers and tributes with the same solemnity one gives to a ceremony they are watching on a screen. Reporters camped outside the hospital with polite brutality, their cameras angled like hawks. Kelly watched, the way one watches a storm approaching from a kitchen window, fascinated, furious, helpless. In the quiet hours, when family and friends dispersed and the machines hummed their endless lullabies, Kelly let herself go. She stood by the window, looked at the city, a quilt of lit windows and distant sirens, and whispered to Mark stories of their children. She told him about the small triumphs, a promotion at school, a play in which their daughter had nailed the big line, the son's newfound interest in cooking. She painted their future in tiny, stubborn strokes because hope, like a stubborn plant in winter, refuses to die simply because the calendar insists it should. There were moments of surreal comedy, hospital gowns that never fit quite right, a television that refused to find the right channel, an overzealous nurse who insisted Kelly drink more orange juice even when her stomach turned. Those moments were not trivial, they were survival. Laughter in a corridor had the power to rearrange fear into something less monstrous for a few minutes. But there was a day when the sun pretended to be gentle and failed, that seared itself into Kelly's memory. Mark had been weaker. The morphine had stolen enough of him that he lay like a map of the man she loved, lines smeared where once there had been crisp definition. They had watched old home videos, grainy images flickering across a thin screen. Their wedding, sunlit and ridiculous, a montage of birthdays, a Christmas when a toddler had wrapped a present in toilet paper and declared it decoration. In those moving pictures, Mark was whole, a man of bulk and laugh and warmth. Kelly pressed her forehead to his and felt the thinnest, most human of things, mortality, press back. He smiled at her then, a slow, tired lift, and in the smile was gratitude. "Tell them," he said, not to the world but to her. "Tell them it was good." She promised she would. But promises made in hospital rooms are complicated things, layered with grief, and the ways in which the world complicates the simplicity of loving. She imagined how she would write about him. Not the disease, but the man who hummed off-key and left his socks in the dryer. She wanted truth, raw and human, not the sanitized eulogies that reduce a life to a bullet-point list of achievements. The media, relentless in its need for narrative, spun its own threads. Headlines wanted drama, a single, sensational sentence that could be amplified into a clip and looped until it meant everything. Kelly refused to let the headlines dictate the shape of their sorrow. She held private conversations with producers and publicists, deciding together what needed to be said and what needed to be kept for the small, tender circle that constituted their family. There were boundaries, lines that fame could not cross without doing violence, and she guarded them like a sentinel. Mark's decline, when it came, was merciful in its brevity. There are cruelties in being spared and cruelties in lingering. Sometimes the universe denies itself the grace of pacing. In his last lucid hour, he held Kelly's hand and repeated the same ridiculous joke about a sponge cake that tasted like disaster. They laughed, the sound ragged and holy, and the children, led by instinct rather than reason, sat and listened and learned what to remember. When the end came, it was quiet, not cinematic. There was no cliché, a last breath taken at the exact moment a choir hits a note. Instead, there was a soft exhale, small as a sigh, and then the odd, absolute stillness that follows the removal of a presence who was once the axis of a life. Kelly felt both empty and profoundly filled. Grief in that moment was as big as the ocean and as particular as the shape of his hand. The world that followed was a collage of condolences and private remembrances. Fans left bouquets outside their home. Friends arranged flowers that smelled like all the seasons. On camera, Kelly's composure unraveled at points. During a taped segment, she simply could not finish, and when she did speak, her voice sounded like gravel. There were days when she could not get out of bed and days when she built her life into something practical, sorting mail, paying bills, tending to the garden Mark loved. Grief has its own timetable, and it refuses to conform to anyone's expectation. Kelly found sanctuary in small rituals. She read Mark's old voice messages until her phone felt like an altar. She cooked dishes he loved and left a plate at the table as if for habit's sake. Their children, fragile and fierce in equal measure, were both corpse and co-conspirator in grief. They made him a scrapbook of shrimps and jokes and ticket stubs, a man preserved by the ephemera of love. They argued sometimes as children do, a tender warfare over who would keep what, who would be the guardian of which joke. In those small fights, grief found a way to keep company with life. The public response was at once warming and invasive.